Hey guys, what's up? And welcome to another episode of the Good Car Show. First of all, Happy New Year to everyone, and we wish you a great 2025. May this year bring you endless joy and prosperity. Now, before we start this episode, I just want to update you on a few changes to the channel that will be happening. First and foremost, of course, please prepare yourself to watch more news, current related discussions being posted on the YouTube channel as well as my TikTok. And also this year, we would like to do many more people-centric stories. So if you guys have any stories you want to share, certain individuals who you want us to highlight, certain people who just need their cause or their troubles aired and to get some support from the public, please get in touch with us. My email is vinod@vmedia.my. It'll be stated in the descriptions of all the videos. Or you can drop us a message on Instagram or TikTok and we will attend to it and hope to get you on the podcast. Now, my guest today, he's a director of Tindak Malaysia, and he works where he basically works to push electoral reform activities. He has spoken and written about open electoral data redelineation. Redelineation. That's going to be a trouble for me, this whole interview, but you get what I'm trying to say. And of course, Malaysian electoral issues in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Singapore, and Kuala Lumpur. And of course, he's appeared on Astro Avani and BFM, among many other news channels. But today, he's putting himself to the ultimate test of coming on the Good Culture podcast. I'm just kidding about that last part. He's none other than Mr. Danesh Prakash Chacko. How are you, Danesh?
I'm good. Thank you for inviting me for your show.
Yes, thank you for coming on. Definitely, I think your topic and your niche is something that is very relevant to politics today and very important, actually. Although we rarely discuss this topic in public discourse, but it's important that we talk about it. Now, before I begin, I just want to get to know you a bit, let the audience warm up to you a bit, Danesh. So your career is pretty much focused on electoral reform, redelineation, there we go, I finally got the word correct, and electoral issues. Yep. So why did you select this niche that's important but rarely spoken about?
It's a very good question that you have asked, because actually my background is I produce maps. That's what I was trained in. And back during my days in studying in Australia, that's the degree I took up. While I was studying
By the way, sorry, just a pause, guys. He's a first-class honors from RMIT. So there we go.
Thank you.
Pride of the Indian community.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, go on.
So during my days studying in Australia, I encountered Malaysian activism. And this is the time leading up to GE13. So I didn't naturally thrust into election issue right away. Initially, I just focused more about Malaysian activism in general. But after GE13, and for your information, my first GE13 vote was done overseas, where they had the concept of overseas advance voting. So we cast our ballots in a consulate. After that, one of the activist groups in Melbourne, that's where I studied, posted a Facebook post from Tindak Malaysia, the current NGO that I'm running, stating that they are looking for volunteers for the redelineation, specifically with the skills such as mapping, Excel, and that sort of stuff. Immediately latched upon the opportunity, and that's how I entered Tindak Malaysia as a volunteer in 2013.
And now you are the director of Tindak Malaysia. So well done you. You've really climbed up, a rank and file guy. You've come up through the ranks. Now, before we get into the crux of this conversation, which is of course on electoral reforms and voting and etc., we live in a very interesting time in Malaysian political, I guess, journey, you could call it, whereby you could see perhaps a disillusionment among voters when it comes to political figures and their promises in manifestos and all that. We have seen recently, of course, people sort of highlighting certain promises that were made during the campaign period, which did not come into fruition now. In fact, even going back on that, we've seen more draconian laws coming out. One could argue the word draconian would be an apt label for that. But I'm just curious when it comes to electoral reform. And of course, we will touch on the fact that there was appointments to the EC that was done without consultation of any parliamentary committee. We'll get to that. But I'm just curious, if the electoral reforms seem to not be the priority for the government of the day, what can NGOs such as Tindak, for example, do to change the electoral, to realize the reforms that you guys want?
I think this is a very important point I need to stress. The electoral reform journey that we took upon is a long term. It goes beyond the current government, that is the Madani government. So for us, we will continue push what we can do, but at the same time, there are openings. For example, reforming the way how the poll workers, or in Malay we call petugas pilihan raya, conduct themselves during elections. This is the opening that we actually immerse ourselves and we push our reform through an inward measure to EC. And also there is a concurrent opening for election observers to help EC to see how the election is done, but from the perspective of independent observers. So we will insert ourselves into this game. So we have to keep our eyes open to all these openings so that we can push for the reform. But to be frank, I'm very frustrated with the lack of progress in terms of electoral reform.
But that brings an interesting point, because I recently interviewed the new chairman of Bersih, Mr. Faisal, and of course, Tindak Malaysia is another NGO that endorses Bersih. And there was an interesting development whereby Bersih was at one point mooted to become a political party, right? Which I thought would be the right thing to do, considering that, like as I mentioned in the previous interview, the heartbeat of any democracy is the ground of the parliament, right? Yep. And if you had a political presence in parliament, then you would be able to push, at the very least, reforms that you want to do. As an NGO, your powers are limited. So can the people truly rely on Tindak to enact these reforms? Or are you all just like Bersih, nothing more than commentators?
We are not just commentators. As a matter of fact, our media presence is far less than our parent endorsing organization, that's Bersih. For us, we signal through the EC. Actually, our main stakeholder is not the parliament, it's the election commission. This is the body that we are really pushing. Do they listen? Yes, they do listen. Do they implement what we need to do or what we suggest? Long way to go. So the question that was posed to me, can the public trust Tindak Malaysia to push forward? I would say the answer is yes, because we want you on board rather than just helping us or just pushing us or relying on us. Be with us through we have three movements. One is the Petugas Pilihan Raya, the poll worker movement, the election observers, the Pemerhati, and the next one is the re-delineation recruitment. Instead of just hoping for Tindak Malaysia to push for reform, sign up to either these three initiatives and let's push for reforms.
All right. And we hope those reforms come to fruition. We definitely do. Now, let's get into the electoral process. What are the problems that you think are the most urgent that are currently burdening our entire electoral process?
The major burden that we have, but it's very difficult to tackle due to political will issue, is a question of electoral boundaries. That is talking about terms of redelineation. So electoral boundaries determine who forms the government at the end of the day. So in Malaysia, we practice a concept called single member territorial representation, meaning one area will send one representative. For example, this area sends one MP. And for the state level, that small area is represented by one adun. Now, how you draw the boundaries will impact the composition and in turn impacts on who forms the government. We are at this particular junction where there is an opportunity for us to rectify the gross malapportionment. When I talk about malapportionment, it's the inequality of voting strength. So on paper, we Malaysians should be treated equally, wherever you are, whoever you are. And how it should manifest in terms of electoral boundaries is each area should have more or less the equal number of voters. Because at the end of the day, the same area would only send one representative. So we have a situation like the parliamentary seat of Bangi has more than 300,000 voters. To give you context, the MP of Bangi is effectively managing an electorate size greater than the size of Perlis. So Perlis has 3 parliamentary seats and Bangi is just 1. But the point is, because Bangi is just one area and Perlis has 3, means Perlis will send 3 and 1. So it means that the voter in Bangi, because you chose to be a voter there, I'm sorry, your vote value doesn't matter. So if you ask me, malapportionment is a big problem. And this is what we in Tindak Malaysia have been pushing this topic for a decade. And I think quite a number of organizations have come to terms about the seriousness about this malapportionment. But of course, the political will is a problem. Now, that is one major burden. Now, there is the other burden. We talk about the conduct of elections. Okay. We know up to GE14, the public does not have confidence in our then election commission on carrying out the elections in a free and fair manner, or more importantly, following according to the laws of the day. So This is why up to GE14, the cause of change of government and the cause of electoral reform came together. Let's be very upfront about that matter. Now, after GE14, we have a reformed election commission. I'm talking just at the commission and the chairman level. And that's where the openings happen. And when we talk about conduct elections, is who carries out the election. Yes, you might say EC is the one who is executing the elections. Actually, the reality is the poll workers, the petugas. We in Tindak Malaysia have long argued, even before G13, that the poll workers should be manned by members of professional bodies or civil societies. And now is the time, after G14, to implement this idea. And this is the interesting thing. This one does not require constitutional amendment. This requires the will of the EC to open up their minds. And that is why we have engagements with EC. And starting from 2019 onwards, we have deployed around 57 poll workers from the civil society or those who have been very familiar with the rules of elections. And this is how we push forward bit by bit of the reform. And that is why you notice by G15, the issues that you tend to plague the G14 has been substantially reduced. And after that, similarly for the 2023 state elections, there remains unaddressed issues. For us, there's two parts we need to solve for the poll workers. One is the manpower. If you ask me, this is the problem. Right now, the manpower is largely recruited by a direction to all civil servants. On election day, please serve as a poll worker. What we are saying now is, now please open it up to the public, like you and me, who are genuinely interested to implement free and fair elections. The selling point for us for this program is you get the chance to implement free and fair elections, not to monitor, not only to observe. You implement. That's one part. The second part we're working with EC is to reform the training, because we have noticed EC has either doesn't have enough budget or just doesn't carry enough amount of trainings. They themselves acknowledge. And we have sat down with EC just telling them, whatever training that you're giving, you have to at least double up. And we in Tindak Malaysia, we're also recruiting our own poll workers. We are doing training on a regular basis. As a matter of fact, one training was done yesterday on the webinar. So we will do this. So this is the second major burden. And the other burden is reforming the election laws so that it strengthens the integrity and also ultimately bring back the EC to have the public confidence that it really needs.
What sort of election laws are you referring to that you say perhaps maybe loose? Because you do mention in some of the interviews before that there are some terms in the Constitution that are kind of vague and all that. But what are the laws that you are specifically referring to that need amendment?
For example, the postal vote regulations, and then the registration of electors. Because for us, we in Tindak Malaysia, we have decided, not to necessarily to my liking, but those Sabah, Sarawak, Labuan voters who reside in Peninsular Malaysia should be now classified as what we call absent voters. So this means that they are not physically present in Sabah, Sarawak, but they are here. And when they become absent voter, they automatically become postal voters. Okay, so that's part of the question of enfranchisement. Then when it comes to the conduct of elections, we want to make it clear that the poll workers lineup should include at least 50% coming from civil societies, members of professional bodies, and people who are genuinely interested in this process. Of course, we are not excluding civil servants. We are saying that if we can't get 50%, we can bring all the remaining civil servants. So these are some of the reforms that we are working on. Postal vote, conduct of elections, Election Offences Act, registration of electors, and the current one we are trying to work on is advanced vote regulation. And this is just in the world of implementing elections. But then it's also the other ones is reforming the constitutions relating to who draws the electoral boundaries. We are telling should not have EC draw the boundaries. We should have a separate commission, an independent commission called a Boundaries Commission to draw the boundaries. EC will absorb a new responsibility, which I strongly believe. The management, especially the registration of political parties and even their elections, should be managed by the Election Commission, not by the ROS. Okay, we have noticed a lot of problems when you try to register political parties with ROS. It's an unaddressed issue. And then when elections takes place in a political party, there's issues. Do you think ROS is the best platform for you to rectify? I don't think so, the answer. I would rather entrust an election management body called the EC to administer this sort of affairs.
Before the PH 1.0 took power, of course, that was when Bersih was a big player in that entire event happening, right? The momentous moment. Why do you think until today, these reforms that you mentioned, which do not sound to be reforms that are too difficult to implement, they seem pretty rational and definitely obvious, if you will. Why hasn't it been implemented, do you feel?
I think this is a very good question that you asked, because it very much ties to one of the things we in Tindak Malaysia would try to, hopefully we can achieve, is the electoral system change. That means to change from first past the post system to, let's say, mixed member proportional.
Okay, perhaps please explain on that so that the viewers can understand as well.
First past the post system is a very simple system. It hinges on that same concept of single member territorial representation. The candidate who polls or who wins the most valid votes, the emphasis I would like to put is most, not majority, most valid votes wins the seat. So imagine there's 3 of us here contesting, and there's 100 votes. 100 voters, 34, I won 34, you won 33, and the other candidate won 33. According to first past the post system,
You win.
I win. Even though 66% said, I don't want me as a candidate. But in a mixed member proportional system, we're going to have 2 forms of seats. One is still will retain the first past the post system as single member territorial representation. That means you are pretty much voting on the basis of the candidate. The other one is using party list. That means you are elected really on the basis on your party flag, not so much of who you are as a person. So the voter can choose, for this area, I will choose party A. And then for the party list, I will choose party B. So you can have 2 options, or they can do party A and party A for both lists. But the end game is when the whole allocation of the seats takes place, it more or less reflects proportionally to the votes. Now, that's just to give you an idea of mixed member proportional. Now, for any electoral system change, and going back to your question about why so much difficulties about changing, right? Is because what we had in 2018 was an elite crash. A section of Barisan Nasional, specifically UMNO before 2018, cracked, and then it created the opportunity to overturn the government. Once the overturn of the government, we had this opening. And as a matter of fact, that opening nearly led Malaysia to adopt a different electoral system. Because after PH 1.0, they had all these different committees taken place. And one of the committees called Electoral Reform Committee, which went across the country, they partnered with Bersih, had all the discussion. And one of the things they suggested is for the DUN level, the State Legislative Assembly, we retain first past the post system. But for the federal level, we will go proportional. We go by party list. But before that could take place, Sheraton move came in. So hence, the plan to study and maybe even eventually implement the electoral system change was stalled. One of the selling points of first past the post system was it always produced stable governments. But in 2022, for the federal level, that notion was broken. Unfortunately speaking, it has not woken up the minds of our politicians that I think it is time for us to start looking for all the different electoral reforms. I understand electoral system change is a difficult question. We can look into that in future. But I think a lot of our politicians feels that, oh, I have gamed the system, I benefited the system, so I don't really need to feel the urgency to push for it. And unfortunately speaking, also like the Parliamentary Special Select Committee we have for our elections, institutions, and human rights, they have been briefed by us by a few times about this need of change. I think it's just taking time for them to see the need to push for that change.
Just to stick on this point still, because I'm just curious, the current system compared to the one that you are suggesting, what would the main benefits be of the second system?
First of all, we have to understand first past the post system on paper was supposed to bring us to what you call the median, means the middle ground. Unfortunately speaking, we have been tilting going too much to the right. So much so.
By right, what do you mean?
Right in the political leaning. Okay?
So more conservative.
More conservative,
Okay.
but more of taking more of a racial and religious angle. On paper, first past the post system is supposed to bring you in the middle. That's not the case. This is actually what I've mentioned here is actually a downside of proportional. What we have is a downside of proportional taking place in first past the post. So we need to create an electoral system where different kinds of views not only contest, but to be represented. Because on a first past the post system, every political party like even some of the political parties that you have interviewed, can contest. No one is stopping you. But will they be represented? We're talking about parties like PRM, like PSM, for MUDA, or any small parties. At first past the post system, I'm sorry, you're not going to get a chance. But when you have an element of proportionality, there is an opportunity for this sort of parties to come into power. And when you have different parties coming into power, the opportunity to formulate different policies come into play. Now, this is what mixed member proportional is able to deliver. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing,
sorry, but it's a more inclusive form of politics, you think?
Yes. Okay. The second one, let's look at the lineup of all the members of parliament, the state legislative assembly person. You notice as such, put the ethnic question aside. Let's look in terms of the youth representation, in terms of women representation, or just represent all the different forms of representations that you could think. This current first past the post system does not create a lineup of leaders that reflecting who you and me. So with the mixed member proportional, there are possibilities for different parties who have different outlook on how do you portray representation. The opportunity for you to not only contest, but to translate their votes into a meaningful representation. And I think that's what we really need, because we are very much stuck with the type of politicians for many decades. And they're aging, and they're pretty much representing the male category, and very limited opportunities for others to rise up to the occasion. So these are, if you ask me, the two things that I wanted to present what mixed member proportional is able to deliver.
But in a mixed member proportional system, what would so you have basically two votes to cast, right? Yeah. One is for the person who represents that entire constituency, and then the party.
Yeah.
Right. So what would the party's role be in this?
That's a good question. Political parties will determine still the candidates. Now, how do you determine candidates falls back to what the political parties has to say. But very important thing is those representing first past the post system of the MMP, these candidates have more leverage, I would say, because you are not only, you may contest under the party flag, but more importantly, you are able to pitch who you are as a person. Now, in the proportional one, it's more of the party leaders, and this sometimes I have to say the downside also, will dictate who in the candidates. Because let's be very clear. Let's say you have 200 party list seats, and the political party wants to field 200 candidates. The political party leaders or the committee will decide who gets selected from number 1 all the way to 200. Of course, on election day, a party will not be in all seats. Maybe only within, let's say, 10 seats. So the party leadership will determine, okay, these are the top 10. This top 10 will go into the legislature. So that's how it works in a proportional.
But when you have a party that's different from the party of the person elected, wouldn't that cause a lot of conflict and thus complicate the whole system?
Let's be very clear. In our first past the post system, we already have a very complicated situation with all the different coalitions. Now,
but in this system, there won't be coalitions then?
There will be coalitions. Actually, as a matter of fact, in mixed member proportional, it's geared more towards coalition systems.
Okay.
So very rarely a political party can win by itself. You have to form partnership. Yeah. And this is why there are challenges, let's be very clear about that, but it also helps to maybe reduce the excessive negative rhetoric. Because sometimes right now is like you see different political parties in Malaysia, coalitions, they can be very intense, saying the other side is the enemy, all the vitriolic statements that you can throw on the other side. But then the time comes, especially let's say after G15, you can't form a government by your own, even as a coalition. Then how do you manage the past rhetoric that you have been shouting with the reality that you had to form government? So maybe if you had a more conciliatory attitude before, the possibility of forming a coalition government would have been a bit more smoother.
Okay. Now, I think I want to jump into another topic that basically we had discussed, and you wanted to talk about this as well. So, by the way, this is, of course, inspired by my previous interview with Mr. Sharad Kutan. By the way, hi, Sharad, and Happy New Year to you as well. I have not called you, and I hope you're doing fine. And basically, in that discussion, I was very critical of democracy, which I still believe is it's a flawed system. I do believe it's a flawed system, and we will, I guess, touch on that. But you have suggested a new form of democracy. Please explain what is your suggestion.
Okay, I think we had to understand for a very long time, the electoral system question, the electoral reform question, always revolve in one form of democracy that we call the representative democracy. That means we choose someone else to represent us. Now, the challenge is the one who's representing us, is he representing himself or the party or the constituents?
Himself.
So this, okay, this is a question that the representative have to address. But at the same time, as a voter, we also ask who he or she is representing. Is it really for us or someone else? And this, when I was reflecting about the recent by-elections, and I noticed sometimes that the turnout rates have been going down, particularly if the seat is urbanized. Not so much for rural. For urbanized constituencies, I notice it's quite strong. You can say, oh, Danesh, it's a by-elections. But I also can see, to a certain degree, these sort of variations that any more urbanized territory, the turnouts are much lower than rural. Then I was reflecting why also the difficulty of people getting involved. And that's where I found out there is a disconnect of the representative and the represented. Now, is representative democracy the only form of democracy? No, there is so many forms of democracy. There's direct democracy, participatory democracy, and deliberative democracy. Now, I've looked into all of this, and I'm trying to figure out which one is a bit more something new for Malaysia. And hence, I stumbled upon, during the COVID time, a talk by one of the members of the Sortition Foundation, who talked about the concept of citizen assembly. Now, citizen assembly is basically a group of people, a body of people that represents the population. And if you ask me if it works out well, it is far more effective than any form of electoral system, because who makes up the body must be as a representative of the area that you're concerned of, be it the locale, the state, or the country. And they have to choose a topic, or there's a topic is presented. And this topic, we are going to have contentious issues. And one of the contentious issues I'm going to put up here right now is the pace of development in urban centers. Now, in Malaysia, we are probably reaching the stage where we're going to have a notion that some of us are more prefer densified development. Some of us say we don't want densified development. Now, if I'm an advocate of local government elections, I think that's something we badly need. But I have to realize one thing. It's a reproduction of representative democracy. So local government elections, what will happen is when the councillors are elected, they might gravitate to one view, either to the densified or the non-densified, and then start pushing for policies that can cause conflicts. Now, when we have to rub a citizen assembly, we're going to have different people with different views. For example, let's say I am not in favor in development in my backyard, the NIMBY. And you, on the other hand, supports more, you're okay with more development or different forms of development in your backyard. I'm a yes in my backyard, YIMBY. So we will have this discussion, not just only we in this table, but different tables, to deliberate and think through. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge one thing. You and I may not be experts on this topic. So the citizen assembly can call upon experts or any other relevant stakeholders to provide the input. But more importantly is the experts or these people don't dictate how the future of the citizen assembly. Their job is to provide you the information that you need to think through. And from there, we have to deliberate what are the things that we need to do. Maybe for this area, we should gravitate more towards to less development. And you will be surprised in this citizen assembly is used to take on extremely contentious issues. Like in Ireland, they talk about legalizing abortion. That if you ask me, is an extremely divisive topic. That I feel that in a representative democracy, they're going to have a deadlock and nothing gets done. Now, citizen assembly can take place in any form of settings. And the beauty of citizen assembly is you don't need to have a constitutional amendment. But the challenge, the main challenge for it, if you ask me, is whether the policymakers associated either at the local, the state, or federal, willing to take up all the resolutions that is made by the citizen assembly for implementation. So I'm inviting any of you who are listening to this, if you think citizen assembly as a concept is worth studying, worth exploring, please reach out to me. I'm actually gathering people for this, to study this concept for 1 year and decide if Malaysia should be a good platform to do citizen assembly. And by the way, in other countries, in mature representative democracies, it's already taking place.
So basically, you're saying that you would have the similar political structure we have now, just at the ground level, at the grassroots level, you will have the citizen assembly that dictates what they want and what they don't want. I think it happens in Brazil, if I'm not mistaken, I think.
That's called participatory budgeting. That's a different.
Different one. Okay.
In Malaysia, we also practice participatory budgeting, specifically in Penang.
Okay.
So, and I'm in favor of that, but I believe that is already been implemented. Like participatory budgeting, if you ask me, since it's already implemented in Penang, please expand it to the whole country.
But the system you're talking about, isn't that already in existence in the form of, instead of individuals, it's sort of like those individuals are in reality now in the form of NGOs such as yourself?
No, because NGOs are always considered as peer pressure groups.
Okay.
We are pressure groups. We represent a particular view. Now, citizen assembly is taking contentious views. So, and it has been used also for electoral reform. Should we change the electoral system? So you and I might have totally different views. You and your group may advocate, let's retain first past the post system. I would say, no, we need to have mixed member proportional. But during the citizens' assembly, that's the moment we will decide and we'll talk, we deliberate what's the way forward. Should we or should we not? And also one last point also. One of the reasons why the citizen assembly I'm pushing, this is an ideal sense, is because representative democracy, if you notice, the electoral cycles is only 5 years, 5 years, 5 years. That means a lot of the policies are not for the long term. Now, citizen assembly, we don't go by the cycles. It's more about what you produce from it. So you're looking from the longer term.
Could that be also caused by the fact that we are now practicing a post-electoral coalition system as opposed to what we had before? So whereby if you look at the BN government of before, the 60 years that they were in power, you had all this. You had statesmen who were willing to look far, development programs. The NEP is one good example, NDP and all that stuff. But now we can't really do that because even today, there are calls for our PMX to resign. So there is no stability in Malaysia's political system now simply because there is no one coalition that can command the simple majority to dictate the way things are. Isn't that the main problem?
If you ask me, that's one problem of it. But let's be very clear. How the parliamentary cycle works? It's 5 years and 5 years. So all politicians, they are gambling or whatever, just trying to think, how can I survive for this term? And then we'll figure out the next term, the next term, and the next term. When we have pressing problems, for example, like climate change, which is not constrained by your 5 year cycle, then I feel that this is where the representative democracy is failing. And you notice that the reason why citizen assembly gained popularity in some places is because of this sort of failures of the future-looking, the lack of future forward-looking of the representative nature of democracy.
Okay, let's get into another segment, which is re-delineation. Of course, this is something that has been a discussion point for decades, and apparently, correct me if I'm wrong, but the average the amount of times it happens in Malaysia is once every 8 years. And I just want to ask you on that note, is that a stable way to govern a country when you're continuously changing borders, amending borders?
If you ask me constituency boundaries, because they represent the electorate for a Malaysian case, then you have to man the boundaries. Let's say we still retain the first past the post system, the consequence is very real because the first past the post system, all constituencies have an X amount of voters. And if you do not change, what happens is some places will have far less voters and will be having still one representative, but another place will have a lot of voters. And one of the things I also want to challenge this notion is it's not just urban-rural divide. The notion about this whole unfair redelineation is, the rural seat has too little voters, the urban place got too many voters. In Malaysian case, sometimes it's possible for some rural semi-urban constituencies to have more voters than the urban areas. And one thing I have also studied the data is very interesting is those constituencies who resides the old part of the towns are depopulating. We're talking about hearts of Georgetown, let's say even Bukit Kasing in Petaling Jaya. Recently I looked at Kota Kinabalu, there's one place called Api Api, which is heart of KK. Yeah, actually depopulating. despite even Undi 18, because Undi 18, what they did is brought 5+ million voters. So naturally, all constituencies would have grown. But Undi 18 cannot stop the depopulation of these smaller urban constituencies. That means at some stage, or it's already happened, these urban constituencies will have more voting power than your rural. And also, more important, on another interesting thing is you can have one constituency, urban, very few voters, sitting next to another constituency, urban, too many voters. That means this person's voting power and this person's voting power is so far apart despite they are 1 or 2 kilometers away. So is this unfair? Of course it's unfair. So this means that we need to change the electoral boundaries. Now, I need to clarify. In Malaysia, there are 3 triggers for redelineation. First, the least likely, but it has happened before, admission of new states or changing of state boundaries. Yeah. So, for example, there has been talks
Kelantan,
about...
I think.
No, not Kelantan. There's been talks of bringing Kuala Lumpur back to Selangor, on and off. Let's say Kuala Lumpur brought back to Selangor. That's alteration of state boundaries. That means you have to do redelineation right away because you now have to create state constituencies for KL. The other example is whenever you create the federal territory like KL, Putrajaya, Labuan, that triggers redelineation. Least likely form. Then the one that is commonly associated, no less than 8 years from the previous cycle. We used to have an upper limit of 10 years, but now, unfortunately speaking, has been taken out. So what it means is, if you look for Peninsular Malaysia plus Labuan, the last exercise was done in 2018, so the next one is 2026. Sarawak was 2015. Can do anytime now, and since 2023. And particularly this year, Sabah's last exercise was 2017. From February onwards, Sabah may experience redelineation. But for practical reasons, because they're having a state elections, you wouldn't necessarily do it right away. So this is the second trigger. The third trigger is when you change the number of constituencies. Be it at the federal, means more MPs, or less MPs, which is highly unlikely, or at the state level. So recent examples is the Sabah back in 2016 added 13 new aduns, sufficient enough to trigger redelineation. So these are the 3 triggers of redelineation in Malaysia.
Now, one interesting thing is, I think on the Tindak's Facebook page, you were talking about the electoral redistricting app, ERA.
Yeah.
Right? And you talked about how this app can assist people, whether layman or whether from the EC as well, to draw fair boundaries at the national and state level. So what, in your mind, constitutes a fair boundary?
It's a very good question you've asked. Now, what constitutes a fair boundaries? I think I would summarize into 3 letters, ARE, accessible, representative, and equal. So first of all, when we draw constituencies, is the constituencies accessible, let's say from a central point or anything of that manner? Not such that especially the elected representative had to go around through another constituency or had to travel too far away and everything. Because the sad fact, because of some constituencies in Malaysia, we have what we call exclaves. You have main constituencies shaped like this, then another constituencies in between, and one part of this constituency is on the other side. This takes place somewhere in Sampurna, in Sabah. So we don't want all that. Now, the second one is a representative. How you draw the constituency? Is it respecting local ties? Local ties, there's so many forms of definition of local ties. Does it respect local authority boundaries? Because that impacts your life and my life very closely. Who do you deal with, your Majlis Bandaraya? And that also have an impact for our MPs and aduns because they are dealing with these councils. So if you have a constituency with having too many local councils, can you imagine the pain that the adun has to go through? Because this area belongs to that council with its own bureaucracy, that council has a different bureaucracy. Or the other thing is the constituency respects the linguistic boundaries of that manner? We try not to talk about it from an ethnic point of view because the risk is ethnic gerrymandering, manipulation of electoral boundaries or in favor of someone. Or look at district boundaries, or how do you subdivide even, let's say, parts of Klang? Do you follow, let's say, the development plans of the future, which they have their own partitions? Then equal. Equal goes back to what I've talked about. Is it fair to have one constituency having 300,000 voters when you have one state has 3 parliamentary seats, for example, which has combinations far less voters than the Bangi itself? So when you talk about equal, then that's where we need to talk about a limit. You cannot just simply say equal. The problem with the Malaysian constitution is vaguely worded. What it means is the number of electors among the constituencies in a state is to be approximately equal with the exception of this and this. Approximately equal what? See, you didn't define what
it's very
it is.
vague.
But in our Merdeka...
It says approximately equal in the constitution.
Yeah, so approximately equal means 1 to 1 or 4 to 1, 2 to 1, 10 to 1, up to the EC to interpret. And you can't really challenge this in our court. Previously in Malaysia, when we came out as independent, particularly in the Malayan side, Malaya independence in 1957, we had very clear statement. Within the state, it should be plus or minus 15%. So what it means is, let's say you have one state, let's say only have 100 voters. That means, of course, you can't draw all constituencies to be, let's say, to 100 or something. Sorry, I rephrase it. You have one state, let's say you have 100 voters, and you have 10 seats. So 100 divided by 10, you get the average of 10. Now, obviously, you can't draw all constituencies to have equal of 10. So you put a plus or minus 15. That means no less than 8.5 voters or more than 1.15. Okay, that's for simplicity purpose. But it gives you a limit so that the EC doesn't go beyond that. Right now, we don't have a limit. So this is what I summarize this. Is the constituency accessible internally? Is it representative of the scene, the area? And is it equal? So if these are the elements that I feel is needed to create fair constituencies for Malaysia.
Let's talk about gerrymandering, because that is definitely a problem, right? We cannot deny that every politician has his own interests. Every political party wants to stay in power. So thus, you could expect that this is a severe problem. How big is it a problem in your eyes in terms of how big a role does it play in sort of messing up our system?
Historically, it used to mess up the system. Because if you ask me, Malaysia, to be more specific, Malayan electoral boundaries when it was first conceived in the 50s, the gerrymandering issue wasn't there. The issue we started right away was malapportionment. So in terms of priority, we in Tindak Malaysia historically have said this, and now I'm telling this again. Fix the malapportionment, you're effectively going to fix the gerrymandering. Now, gerrymandering is basically manipulating electoral boundaries to favor certain political parties. I believe in the Malayan context, Malayan side, it didn't appear, but later it appeared in the Malaysian setting from 1974 onwards, where you have very odd-looking constituencies start popping up. But that time, you create this sort of extremely irregular constituencies that favor certain ethnicities. So just to clarify, one other thing is, our first era of gerrymandering tend to more take on the ethnic element. So you like to pack the voters of one certain ethnic group to this area and then the other ethnic group to other area. So it took more of an ethnic element. What happened in the 1990 elections? The idea of using gerrymandering and malapportionment to, at that time, to strengthen Malay dominance for Peninsular Malaysia didn't work out very well because there was a resurgence, the PAS was getting stronger. But of course, it didn't end BN rule. So as the years went by 2003, again, PAS being a very strong political party, a force in 1999 elections, the gerrymandering have taken of a different angle. It's not so much just about ethnicity. Now you have to gerrymander more from a political calculations. So of course, there was the ethnic element. So this time gerrymandering kind of, for Malayan side was more towards favoring the Chinese and Indians. Because on the premise that in 1999, the Chinese and Indians more gravitated to Barisan Nasional, while the Malays will start deciding towards PAS. The only problem with this sort of political-based gerrymandering is it assumes that the past voting pattern of yesterday is the same at the given point of the gerrymandered point of view. And then the moment you call immediate election, you just pretty much certify that outcome. For example, if I gerrymander this constituency to be BN, based on past results, the immediate elections, can you produce BN? Now, with the growing awareness that was taking place, thanks to the Bersih rallies and the movements, even like Tindak Malaysia, people started to wake up and need to act on it. And this is why in 2018, when you redraw the electoral boundaries, the intention was to create a BN victory. In the end, from my calculation, is like only one out of many seats that they tried to rig the boundaries only favored BN. The rest was just completely nullified and went to the other side. Just to give an example, the Lumut parliamentary seat, which was home to a huge naval base, historically supporting Barisan Nasional. So Lumut, this is explicit gerrymandering taking from an ethnic and political angle. They carved out literally one state constituency out, which is predominantly Chinese, Astaka, and took it out and moved to the other one. And that left Lumut with a very mangled shape. And the idea was, in 2018, BN is supposed to win. What happened in 2018? That seat fell to Pakatan Harapan. Gerrymandering was nullified. So that's, if you ask me today, is it really worth gerrymandering? Yet, I would be upfront, it's not worth it because you can't guarantee what you're basing it on today. So yes, it is a problem. Is it a main problem? I would say it's a secondary problem to malapportionment. The only challenge I would tell you upfront with gerrymandering is, how do you prove the intent? Because let's say if you want to challenge this in the court or anything like that, you need to prove the intent. Malapportionment is different. Malapportionment is very mathematical. Okay, this constituency exceeded this amount of percentage, we know it's malapportionment, or that percentage. Yes, it's still debatable, but you know how to figure this out. But when it comes to gerrymandering, you need to show evidence. The only thing what I've been explaining to you are all the signs of evidence. The other thing I would need to highlight, like for example in Sabah, it's a very interesting situation. There are 30 new constituencies that were formed. I believe it was designed to help Barisan Nasional, but that was created in 2016. What happened in 2016? We had the formation of Warisan, the breakaway from UMNO. And interesting thingly is the redelineation for Sabah was done so quickly. Started in September 2016, submitted to the Prime Minister in February 2017. And that time was our Prime Minister Najib. He could have easily tabled that report of Sabah to Parliament. He didn't. He didn't do it. And it's very serious situation because for the 2018 elections, is Sabah going to run on 60 old seats or 73 new seats? So in 2018, when the state elections took place, we had a hung state government. No one formed a government right away. So Warisan-led government eventually prevailed. Then in 2019, 2 years after that, they took out that report and then they tabled it. Of course, by then, all the political calculations of the 30 new seats are pretty much redundant.
Yeah.
So my point is, gerrymandering, secondary problem, not worth your time because you have no guarantee the constituencies that you create to your favor will be on your favor tomorrow.
Interesting. Since you bring up Borneo, recently, of course, I think late last year, there was a report that Sarawak is going to go through a process of re-delineation, whereby they foresee this process may result in an addition of 10 parliamentary seats to Sarawak. Now, if this happens, considering Sabah and Sarawak's roles as kingmakers in our federal level elections, how do you think this would sort of affect the balance of power between Borneo and Malaya?
First of all, the commitment to add seats, they only talk about it. But will I see they're going to implement is another thing, because it ties eventually to the whole question about the wanted representation called. But what I understand, even our Deputy Prime Minister said, who's from Sarawak, we'll look into this after G60. Okay, now put that aside. When you have 10 new parliamentary seats in Sarawak, question is, where does the 10 new parliamentary seats are going to be located? Is it going to be all being added in the Kuching area, in the Cebu area, or the Miri area, or is it in the rural area? Because if we go strictly by population or the electorate size, I would say, yeah, Kuching really deserves more parliamentary seats. Cebu deserves more parliamentary seats, and even Miri would have deserved, right? So if that happens, then it may favor more to Pakatan Harapan side. Now, what happens if it is not necessarily in the urban settings? You start creating seats, more seats, 10 parliamentary seats in Kapit, in Baram, some very interior parts, so let's say Muka, the coastal Muka, or even Masgaring. then it will favor more towards Gabungan Party Sarawak. So it depends on where the seats are going to appear. So I can't give you a clear-cut answer because, yes, at this point, one could favor PH more directly, but we also know PH is, the Madani government is made of PH plus GPS. Then at the same time, GPS, if you give more than rural seats, they will play a bigger role in Kingmaker, and they could demand more concessions out of whoever forms the government.
Now, just going off tangent on that point, I think it was mid last year or perhaps early last year. I remember this being mentioned briefly, but there was sort of talks about how the Madani government wanted to split existing large constituencies. Basically, the reasoning that was given by the opposition at that time. I remember it was also mentioned on the Keluar Sekejap podcast that they talked about how this would be the only way for PH to earn more seats in parliament because, as we all know, PH struggles to garner they are famous with the non-Malay but not the Malay, basically. Do you think, in your opinion, that that would be the only strategy for PH to maintain their position in the government in incoming elections?
I think that's not the only one, because I think we have to understand that Madani government that we have, particularly with PH component, who they are resonating with is a crowd size that is they already reached the limits. Now you want to talk about growing further. Now when you talk about growing further, that's where we need to talk about why PH is not able to break more ground in, let's say, more the semi-urban areas or areas outside the urban centers. Because I also studied the by-election results, and it's very fascinating because this by-elections was being, especially after 2023, it's like pretty much every month we're having by-elections.
Yes.
It is actually a barometer, and it gives me an insight on how this Madani government performs. What I noticed is, after even the 2023 state elections, Madani government doesn't seem to capture the Malay vote bank, be it in urban, semi-urban, rural. And if you ask me, the low point was Sungai Bakap. Right? Sungai Bakap was a disaster for them. And consider for a long time, Sungai Bakap in Penang was part with PKR. Right? And this is PKR's also responsibility, specifically to reach out to the Malay vote banks of the suburban areas. What happened after that is, in the Nangiri by-election, BN pulled a victory. It was a complete BN tsunami. And one of the clear things I remember is BN made it clear that some certain parties in PH, you shouldn't come in there.
DAP was one of them.
DAP one of them. Because BN really literally mobilized its own machinery, and Perikatan Nasional, unfortunately, for their own strategic miscalculation, chose the wrong candidate. Effectively, what I understood is PAS imposed a candidate on Bersatu. And for Makota, also BN tsunami. Again, BN took the lead. So one of the things I noticed is BN now has been resuscitated, but it's because it was able to go back to its own politics of development. And it was able to reach out to the semi-urban, the rural, as demonstrated in Nangiri, very rural, Malay plus Orang Asli, and Makota, which had a fair variety of ethnicities. PH needs to reflect on itself based on all its by-elections. Why is it not able to reach? And if you ask me, the battleground is the Malay seats, and particularly the lower income seats. If you ask me right now, Perikatan Nasional is dominating it, while Pakatan Harapan will dominate a bit more the wealthier seats. So there's an economic inequality manifests itself in the elections itself. So PH needs to see whether are you prepared to go beyond that narrative that you have built, the anti-corruption or institutional reforms. I mean, it matters to me a lot. But if you want to stay in government, you have to go beyond that. And unfortunately speaking, if the failure to address, let's say, economic matters and everything, means it's to the detriment of PH, specifically in Madani.
Again, what you're talking about is, to me, in my eyes, pretty much the problem that we are facing in Malaysia today. In fact, sometimes, and I'll be very honest, to carry out a political podcast on a weekly basis has become a bit of a challenge, because the only thing being discussed is not only, but majority of the news out there centers around race and religion.
Yeah.
One could argue that this problem actually stems from the demographic breakdown in many of the, I mean, you talk about areas, we basically put up candidates based on the majority race in any constituency, right? So when you talk about structuring borders, structuring constituencies, should race and religion be a huge consideration to at least at the very best try to even it out as much as they can? Because that would be, to me, a layman, that would serve as a very potent solution to curb the rise in race and religious politics that we are seeing today.
I reflect back on the question that you have mentioned, to something when Malaysia practiced the very last fair redelineation exercise of 1960. And ECU...
1960?
Yeah, so that was the last fair redelineation exercise.
Fair one.
Fair
My
one.
goodness.
Okay. So just to give everyone a context, because I need to address to that your question, is because in 1960, EC was tasked to draw the electoral boundaries under the strict principles of the Merdeka Constitution, plus or minus 15% deviation, and then draw the constituencies such that you respect the distribution of communities and whatnot. So much so because the boundaries was drawn so fair, I'm not saying it's perfect, it was very fair, that the ruling government of that day decided to end the independence of EC. Okay. One of the discussion points in the Redelineation Report 1960 is, how do you tackle that question, but more from race, not from religious point of view, is they said, we will try to make the constituencies typical of the federation. It means like, we try not to deliberately concentrate communities based on ethnicities. But when we draw the constituencies, we try to see not from an ethnic point of view. It's not like, oh, because it's area more Malay, more Chinese, then we arbitrarily draw a line here. No, we're not doing that. We need to see the relationship at that time, the coastal fishermen with the urban centers, do they have commonality? So when we draw boundaries, let's not center the argument. Unfortunately speaking, this happens even those who want to argue for fair boundaries. And the intention is good, but unfortunately the way you argue is wrong. Or how do we ensure ethnic representation? I'm sorry to say, if you go down with that path, or we need to draw boundaries with ethnic consideration, I wouldn't be surprised that you will be committing ethnic gerrymandering. So how are we different to, let's say, the previous redelineation exercises that was hinging on ethnicity? So we need to go back to what defines local ties. What defines local ties? Like, for example, local authority areas, district boundaries, the subdivisions of local authorities, subdivisions of the districts, or maybe for particularly, like, let's say in Sabah, Sarawak, linguistic boundaries. I was recently informed that one of the districts, or even the divisions of the Bahagians of Sarawak, that's called Serian, was drawn such that it ignored the linguistic differences of the Bidayo language. So again, when you draw all the electoral boundaries, you need to consider all these factors. But ethnicity or even religion should not be the argument to be used for this.
But is that a pragmatic approach? Because in Malaysia, race and religion play a huge part in our daily lives, especially in politics.
It is. But when it comes to electoral boundaries, do we need to subscribe to that? No. Because that is a thing. Race and religion is something I felt that needs to be addressed, of course, partially from electoral system reform, but also from other angles, but not from the perspective of electoral boundaries.
Fair enough. I mean, I don't see that, to be honest, because I feel that then how do we curb this rise of identity politics, race, religious politics that is happening now?
I speak more from an electoral system point of view.
Yeah.
Our first past the post system, unfortunately, favors larger parties, one, and those larger parties who represent a particular community, this will amplify the voices. And then, unfortunately speaking, through gerrymandering and malapportionment, that makes this whole is a cocktail of more problems that reinforces all of this. Now, so much so when you have other political parties who want to look from a different angle, from an environment point of view, from an economic point of view, from a class point of view, they don't get a chance. This is where we need to talk about changing the electoral system to let's say, something that includes proportionality. Let's say mixed member proportionality. Some of us want mixed member majoritarian, whatever it is. So that there's different voices that I talked about. There are those who want to advocate for economy, environment, and class, or anything of that manner, get the opportunity not via the first past the post system, but through a party list. When they appear in the parliament, that's where the opportunity comes for us to challenge. I'll tell you upfront, this is a long way to go. Question is, are we willing to push for it? Are we willing to bear the pain until we see this see through?
I just want to get your input on this because since we are talking about race and religion, I recently interviewed Maria Blachin and forget his name, the guy who also went for the Bursa Championship. What's his name? The Indian guy.
Gopalan.
Gopalan, yeah, sorry. I apologize, Gopalan. It's been a long day. So when I interviewed both of them, of course, their main cause now is definitely to push for more female representation in Parliament, which I don't really agree with. I was very clear to Maria Blachin that I didn't really agree with that. Because perhaps I come from a different generation, so I want the best to lead, not your gender doesn't matter to me, right? But when we see that in today's climate, in today's society, where the importance or the voice of certain communities are being drowned out by the majority, do you think that it would make more sense to fight for a quota system for ethnicities in political parties? If electoral boundaries are not the answer, could that be a solution to curb the growing of racial and religious politics? Or in perhaps another way, could it be a solution to hearing the voices of different communities more effectively?
I think it's a great point that you have entered talking about quota, because we in Tindak Malaysia, we also have voted on the decision. Should we support for the call for quota for women representation? And I leave it open to all my volunteers. Do you want to go say yes or no? I don't judge. Or majority of us voted no. Because, and how, even I personally feel quota as a legislated manner is not the answer. It's a band-aid to the problem. It's a shortcut to achieve without addressing the structural problems. But I am perfectly okay for quotas to appear in political parties. It should be voluntary and it should be incentivized internally, right? So for example, if political parties who wants to implement quota, my answer is go ahead if you think that's a message that you want to push for. Now, the thing is, do we have the incentive structure for them to move? And we are talking about, we have, I'll be upfront, there's a lack of it. Of course, there are certain political parties, such as DAP, I notice they make a conscious effort for pushing up people of different ethnicities as one, second, women and youth. So this is something that we can look into how certain political parties are doing in the current framework, and there is no incentive, there's no legislation required.
Okay, of course I want to get to this, our final segment, but I want to touch on this because you mentioned in a BFM interview, which I found the interview very interesting. By the way, guys, if you want to check it out, you can check it on BFM. It's on YouTube as well. Very, very, very interesting discussion. But majority of the discussion basically centered around you saying you had an issue with voters who go back home to vote instead of voting where they are. You said that this, because the policies enacted in your state, in your location, would directly impact you as opposed to what happens at home. Now, we know that urban voters and rural voters vote differently, okay, because perhaps their level of exposure, knowledge, etc., income levels and all that. Don't you think, and this is because urbanization happens everywhere, right, that the urbanized voters from, say, location A, when they return, they will serve as a very good check and balance to mitigate the gap that the existing voters there who are in location A, for example, may not see in the entire political game, that these urbanized voters may be able to provide an opposition a bit to the candidates that are seeking the vote.
I actually have heard that argument before, and I asked because I said I encountered this argument through one of my friends. Why do you want to go back and everything when you could have voted here? Or because we want to bring change over there. That's a political question. So if you ask me, I still stand on my ground on this. You should vote where you live because you're affected by the policies around you. And for the rural area, especially even for candidates, I'm not surprised if some of the candidates having difficult time. One perspective is how do you bring this external outstation voters to come back to vote, and that makes a difference whether you win or not, right? So imagine we didn't have that. Maybe this candidate would have repurposed and repositioned his or her line of argument to the context here, not just saying I need to appeal this voter from who doesn't really stay in 5 years in my constituency but only comes back once a while. For me, that's how I see it. And one more thing is I need to emphasize is, as mentioned in the interview, is certain state governments have made it very clear. Their welfare policies hinges that where you vote.
Yeah.
So much so there's one constituency, there's a former Adun who, for one of the constituencies in Selangor, I remember one of the requirements, if you want to get some benefits or support, you must be a voter of that constituency.
Which makes sense. Definitely makes sense, right?
So for me, it's like, okay, these very bold initiatives. And I think it reinforces my belief. You are affected by the surrounds. Now, the idea that you want to bring back your change to the people over there, is it the only way that you could think is by being a voter of your hometown? Not necessarily. You could go with the political party that you go with and push that argument. Instead of just going back for that 1 day or 2 days, why don't you just go and campaign with the political party, stay for 1 week and change the constituency if you believe so?
It won't happen so fast, Danesh. Come on. I mean...
But my point is there are other options.
Tougher ones, longer ones.
Yes, and also, I mean, that's or the other one is you keep on spreading the messages via online through your discussions with your family and friends,
Through having you on the podcast, we can discuss. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. No, that's fair. I know, but like for me, for example, because when you said that, it really hit home for me because if I were to change my address, I would be in Sapute, but Sapute is Teresa Cox. I mean, she's going to be here for a long time. Nobody's defeating her. So my current voting station is in Parang Jambu, in Melaka. And I go back there because Melaka, I want to make sure that, PH wins. So anyway, Danesh, I want to say thank you. I wish I had more time. Definitely, I'd like to have you back on.
Thank you.
Really fun talking to you, man. And
thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here. And definitely, we must do this again. I think there's so many issues that we've not discussed. I had a lot of fun talking to you, and hope you had a good time.
Same to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, buddy. So, guys, that's all we have today. Again, Danesh, what an interesting conversation. I hope he comes back. And if you guys have any questions, thoughts, please share them in the comment section. We may address them in the next interview when Danesh has the time to return in between his fight for electoral reform. Congrats, by the way, on all your success. Doing a fantastic job, buddy. So as always, guys, that's all we have. Our next interview will be with Javier Justo, the 1MDB whistleblower, along with many other political topics we'll be addressing on the show. So till next time, take care, guys. See you soon. And as always, have a great week. Bye.